Lou wants to get through.
Oh, Lou's always in the way.
You don't want to do this to me.
I do so.
No.
I do so. I do so. You're like, this is huge. This is. I should have had it written out, but I think it's better if it's not.
Oh,
It comes from my heart. Hi, if we can get everybody. I'm not sure if this thing's on. Hello? I don't think this is on. Maybe I have to turn it on? How do you turn it on?
It's on. Hold on.
Testing, testing. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our party. And this is a party that you all get to learn a little bit more about APP. And one of the reasons this is very dear to my heart is because I have an uncle that has been gone for over 20 years. And he played a big role in writing a book and bringing attention to Albertans about the importance of Alberta becoming free. And we are privileged to have his eldest son, Lowell, with us. And Lowell played a big role in getting this book together that Elmer put together. And so I encourage you to get to know Lowell and everything he has to share from his past. Because this is, Michael Wagner is adding to it. And we're just kind of like piggyback. Michael Wagner is going to come up and speak next, but somebody else will introduce him. But you know what? Just before we get the speakers going, how about we sing "Oh Canada" one more time? And if Chad is here, I'll let him get us on a right key this time. Chad, are you here? Okay, then it's my key. All right, everybody. Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all our sons' command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, a true north, strong and free. From far and wide, oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Yay for Canada! Okay, get to know this man. And now Al's going to introduce Michael.
Okay. Michael Wagner is our next speaker, and he's an independent researcher and writer. He's a columnist for the Western Standard. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree, honors, and a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Calgary, and he obtained his PhD in Political Science from the University of Alberta. His book, Alberta, Separatism Then and Now, accounts how federal government policies have been designed to exploit the West, Alberta in particular. Most recently, he has been strongly advocating for Alberta independence. He boldly thrusts the argument for an independent Alberta into the limelight with another of his published works, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. He and his wife, Ivy, have 11 children and have been homeschooling for over 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage. Shedding some light on our independence journey, Dr. Michael Wagner.
Thank you for that introduction, Al. I'm just going to stand behind this podium. I need it for my papers. No problem. Good. So tonight I want to talk about why Alberta needs to become independent. Right up to your mouth, Mike. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll try and remember to keep it here. I want to talk about why Alberta needs to become independent. And I'm going to look at this from a historical perspective, because I think to understand the need for independence, you really have to look at Alberta's history, because it's easiest to understand the independence sentiment as building over time. For generations, Westerners have felt neglected and exploited by Eastern Canada. And as the sentiment builds over time, more and more people see independence as the best alternative. The U.S. Declaration of Independence uses the phrase "a long train of abuses" to describe why the British colonies needed to become independent. And I think it would also be appropriate to say that Alberta has experienced a long train of abuses from Central Canada, and that would explain why we need to become independent. So right from the beginning of Western settlement, people have felt neglected by Central Canada. This part of Canada, the Prairie West, was originally part of Rupert's Land and was purchased by Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company in about 1870. So that there were people living here already, but the land was purchased and annexed to Canada without consulting the people that lived here. You might remember there was a relatively large settlement at Red River. There were thousands of people there, and some of the people there had a different idea about what their political future should hold, but they were annexed to Canada without being consulted, and that contributed, one of the factors that contributed to the Riel Rebellion of 1869 and 70. Then after Canada got this land, of course, they brought in settlers to create an agricultural economy, and that was good, of course. But the farmers that were here faced certain disadvantages. For on the one hand, there was a protective tariff, which compelled them to purchase their equipment from Central Canada. So they had to pay more money for the equipment that they purchased from Central Canada. Then also when they sold their grain, they had to sell it through middlemen. So they lost some of the price that way. And they also had to pay the transportation costs for the grain. So they lost money that way. So they had to pay more for their equipment, and they received less for the grain that they had. Now, they didn't just sit back and take it. They fought back politically. One of the ways they fought back was especially by turning away from mainstream political parties and forming alternative political parties. You might remember that Alberta had a United Farmers of Alberta government from 1921 to 1935. And in the 1920s, the biggest federal political party here was called the Progressive Party of Canada. Now, the word progressive meant something different then than it means today. But again, it was an alternative party for Westerners to fight back against the Eastern parties. The biggest, though, the most unique party that arose from the West was the Social Credit Party, and Alberta elected a social credit government in 1935. It was something that was so distinctive that it was international news when Alberta elected that social credit government in 1935. And Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report, he wrote this about that occurrence. When Alberta elected that social credit government, he wrote, "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." Yeah. So Albertans did fight back against Central Canada, but at that point, nobody was really talking about independence. It wasn't a fight for independence. It was just a fight through these alternative parties against central government. But the idea of Alberta becoming independent began to become more popular when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. There was kind of like a threshold that was crossed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. As you might remember, that Pierre Trudeau, one of the main reasons that motivated him to become involved in politics was to make Quebec feel more at home within Canada. So one of his first policies was the Official Languages Act, which would make French more common across all of the country, but especially here on the prairies. And there were many people here who felt that they were having French shoved down their throats. So the first book about Western independence was written in 1971. It was a collection of essays. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. And these essays were edited by John Barr and Owen Anderson. And the reason that's significant was that John Barr at that time was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education, and Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta's Premier Harry Strom. So these were influential men who were writing about the possibility of Alberta independence. Now, most of the essays were not in favor of independence. They mostly talked about decentralizing Canada. But John Barr himself wrote one where he talked about the possibility of independence. And his idea was this. He said, what we need to do is try and reform Canada and to make it more beneficial for Alberta. And if we can't do it, then Western Canada is going to have to become independent. So his idea was, let's try reform first. And if reform doesn't work, then we'll become independent. And you'll still hear that same idea from many people today saying, well, let's try to reform Canada first before we move towards independence. But that idea has been talked about now for over 50 years. Anyway, the idea was to give Canada one more chance. And actually that made sense in 1971 because there hadn't been an independence movement and there was still, there's still the possibility of reform. So in 1971, that made sense, possibly reforming Canada. Now, 2 years after that book came out in 1973, the energy crisis started because of a war in the Middle East. The Arab countries were fighting with Israel, and the price of oil because of that war skyrocketed. So now Alberta could finally cash in on its oil resources. Of course, we'd been selling oil for many years already, but the price of oil was actually quite low, and so Alberta, the benefit Alberta received was quite minimal. But when the price of oil skyrocketed in 1973 and throughout the 70s, this was a chance for Alberta to really reap the benefits of its oil resources. But Pierre Trudeau did a couple of things to prevent that from happening the way it should have. For one thing, he kept the price of oil low within Canada, so that Alberta oil sold within Canada would be sold much less than the world price, like about half price. So Alberta would not get the proper benefit on its oil that was sold within Canada. And he also put an export tax on oil to the United States, because Alberta sold lots of oil to the United States. So when the oil was sold from Alberta, the federal government would get quite a bit of that money. So whether Alberta sold the oil within Canada or exported it, it was not getting the full benefit of its resources. And you might remember during the 70s, Peter Lougheed fought against those policies with Pierre Trudeau. In 1979, there was a federal election, and Joe Clark was elected as prime minister with a minority government for the Progressive Conservatives. He was a member of parliament from Alberta, so it was expected that he would be a better prime minister for Alberta, and he might have been, but his government only lasted a few months, and then because it was a minority government, it fell in parliament, and there was a federal election. So there was a federal election in February of 1980, and this is a very significant federal election. Of course, the most significant thing was that Pierre Trudeau was re-elected as prime minister. But during the election campaign itself, the Liberals deliberately chose to run a very, very divisive campaign, a very regionally divisive campaign. And one of the prominent Liberal campaign officials would later say the Liberals' unofficial motto for that election campaign was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." So normally in a federal election, national leaders will try and smooth over regional differences, because any big country like Canada, there'll be regional differences, and national leaders will be expected to smooth over those differences to create unity. But in this case, they decided to run a deliberately divisive campaign where they would say that Alberta was the bad guy, and by re-electing the Liberals, Alberta could be put in its place. So by running this very divisive campaign, this is how Pierre Trudeau was re-elected. Now, the day after that election, the election was on February 18th. The following day, an Edmonton businessman named Elmer Knudsen wrote a letter to the Edmonton Journal where he argued that Quebec had basically taken over the country with that 1980 election, and that Canada must divorce Quebec, or that the Western Canada must become independent. So that Elmer Knudsen, after that letter, led to a massive response where he received thousands of letters and phone calls of support from people in the West. And that led to the meeting, which created an organization called WestFed. It was the first mass membership Western independence organization. So during the summer of 1980, WestFed would hold meetings right across Alberta, especially in rural areas, and they'd get like 200 or 300 people out to each meeting, sometimes up to 600. So WestFed was kind of the APP of its day. And I specifically wanted to mention that with Elmer Knudsen because, as Lois mentioned, Lois's maiden name was Knudsen. Elmer was her uncle. So there's a direct connection between what happened with WestFed in the 1980 and what's going on here today. There's a direct line. The spirit of defiance that motivated Elmer Knudsen continues to motivate some of his descendants in the next generation. So there's a direct connection between what happened then and what happened now. Anyway, later in 1980, Pierre Trudeau introduced the National Energy Program that would help that was intended for the federal government to take over more of Alberta's oil industry. And there is, of course, considerable controversy, and many people in Alberta were extremely upset about the National Energy Program. And this is led to a permanent change in Alberta's political culture, because before 1980, whenever surveys were done about support for independence in Alberta, there was single-digit support. Be 5 or 6 or 7% of people would support Alberta independence. But from 1980 onwards, it's always been double-digit support. Sometimes as low as 15 or 16%, but more commonly, 25% or more of people will support Alberta independence. So the change in that support happened in 1980, and that was the result of Pierre Trudeau and the National Energy Program. So that's why I refer to Pierre Trudeau as the father of the Alberta independence movement, because he's the one who made it so popular in the West. Anyway, as a result of that sentiment, in 1982, there was a by-election in the Olds Didsbury constituency, and the Western Canada Concept Party, which was a separatist party, elected a member of the Alberta legislature. So it was the first time a Western independence political leader was elected in Western Canada. Nevertheless, in spite of the support for independence out here, we still would hear voices of people saying we need to reform Canada rather than become independent. And one of these people was Senator Ernest Manning. He had been Premier of Alberta for 25 years, and after he retired as Premier, he became a senator. And he and two prominent colleagues wrote a book in 1981 called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. And the purpose of this book was basically to argue that Canada's national institutions needed to be reformed in order to incorporate Western representation. And if they weren't reformed, then the idea of Western independence would become much more popular and maybe even come to fruition. So they proposed Senate reform. That was the idea that they had, that if we could reform the Senate with representation from the West, then the West would not feel the need to get out. But of course, their proposals were ignored, and that never happened. So in 1984, Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister. He was replaced by John Turner as the Liberal leader and as Prime Minister. Then a few months later, there was a federal election, and Brian Mulroney was elected as the Prime Minister in 1984. Now, this should have been a good thing for Alberta. We'd finally got rid of Trudeau. We finally got rid of the Liberals, and every member of Parliament from Alberta was in Brian Mulroney's government. So now we expected to be treated properly, to be treated like an equal part of Canada. But it didn't turn out that way, unfortunately. In 1986, the federal government had to make a decision over the maintenance contract for the CF-18 fighter jets. Canada had recently purchased those fighter jets. They needed to be maintained, and of course, it was a very expensive job to maintain it. So it was very beneficial to whichever company got that contract. So there was a contest. The government would hold a contest to see which company would be the best to maintain the CF-18 fighters, and there were two companies that were competing for that. One was in Winnipeg and one was in Montreal. The Winnipeg company won that contest. Like it had much better. It was much more able to take care of those planes than the company in Montreal. So Winnipeg won it, and the Mulroney government awarded the contract instead to Montreal. So that just showed again that regardless of which party was in power, central government has central Canada has control over the government. Like any particular federal government is going to want to cater to central Canada because that's where the votes are. So even though the government had all of its MPs, all the MPs from Alberta were in that government, they did not have enough influence to get that contract for Winnipeg for Western Canada. This illustrates the problem more generally, that the Conservative Party is not a solution. The federal Conservative Party is not a solution for Alberta's problems. Any Conservative Party government will have to cater to central Canadian voters and not to Alberta voters, because that's where the votes are. So even a Pierre Poilievre government, although it would be better for Alberta, there's no question that a Conservative government is better for Alberta than a Liberal government, but it's still not a solution because they still have to cater to central Canada. So the best case scenario with a Pierre Poilievre government would be that we would get a reprieve. We'd get a reprieve from problems from the east, but it would only be temporary because he would only be Prime Minister temporarily. Then the Liberals would take over again. So the Conservative Party of Canada is simply a band-aid solution to Alberta's problems and not a permanent solution. Now, going back to the 1980s here, because of that CF-18 controversy, there was a rise of a new Western movement that became the Reform Party of Canada. Their motto was "The West wants in," like to bring the West into Canada to be equally represented. And I have here a pamphlet, a photocopy of a pamphlet from 1987, "A New Federal Political Party to Represent the West." Now, this is from the Reform Association of Canada, the precursor organization to the Reform Party. I just want to read a couple of sentences from here because of how accurately they represent the current situation as well. Just fighting with the wind here a bit with these pages. Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Okay. It says this. Oh, okay, thank you. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. So this is from 1987, that's 35 years ago, and we can say the exact same thing today as they wrote 35 years ago because nothing has changed. Now, the following year, a member of Parliament from Edmonton named David Kilgour wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians and Confederation, to explain to Canada why the West felt alienated and why we needed changes. And he was a good man, and he really understood Western Canada. And this is what he wrote in his conclusion. He said, "The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all the other regions of the country." So in 1988, that's 34 years ago, he was saying, the time has come to address the long-standing injustice. And at that time, it looked like the time had come because the Reform Party was growing very quickly and was going to make a difference. Also, of course, the Reform Party advocated for the Tripoli Senate idea, something similar to what Ernest Manning had talked about earlier, so that we'd have a Senate in Canada that would be elected by the people, it would have effective powers, and there would be equal representation from each province. So that would be a way for Western provinces to have influence in the Canadian government. So that would have been a good thing, but of course it never happened. But the Reform Party, most of the members of Parliament from Alberta were from the Reform Party, if you remember, from the 1983 and 1997 elections. 1993 and 1997, most of the MPs we sent to Ottawa were from the Reform Party. Other Western provinces also, of course, sent many MPs from the Reform Party. They were trying to get change originally. They were trying to change Canada and make it more beneficial for the West. But over time, the Reform Party lost its focus on Western Canada and began to focus more on trying to form a national government. So in 2000, it became the Canadian Alliance, and then in 2003 it amalgamated with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, the first leader of the new Conservative Party was Stephen Harper, and he became, of course, the first Conservative Prime Minister. And Harper was from Calgary, and he was one of the original organizers of the Reform Party, so Westerners trusted him to represent our interests. So all the while Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, there was very little support for Western independence because we knew we had, like, our guy in Ottawa, and we could trust him. Unfortunately, in 2015, he lost the election to Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau immediately brought in policies to try and choke Alberta's oil industry. He wanted to prevent the export and development of Alberta's oil resources in order to, prevent climate change. At least that would be his reasoning. So one of the important pieces of legislation he brought in was Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which many people call the No More Pipelines Bill, because the purpose of it is to prevent major infrastructure from being developed, especially pipelines. He also brought in Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which many people call the Alberta Tanker Ban, because the purpose of that law specifically was to prevent Alberta oil from being exported off the west coast of BC. So with those kind of policies and with the carbon tax policies, Justin Trudeau is basically subverting Canada's constitution in the sense that provinces in the constitution are given control and ownership of their natural resources so that they can develop them. But through these kinds of policies, he was indirectly preventing Alberta from developing its resources. So it's a kind of subversion of the constitutional order that Canada is supposed to have. It's indirectly doing what the federal government is not allowed to do specifically. Of course, Alberta's government challenged the carbon tax in court, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Trudeau's carbon tax. Nevertheless, there was a couple of dissenting judges, one of them from Alberta, and he wrote in his dissenting opinion to that decision, he wrote that this carbon tax decision in favor of Trudeau's carbon tax opens the door to federal intrusion into all areas of provincial jurisdiction, because the line of reasoning that allows Trudeau to implement the carbon tax would allow the federal government to interfere in other areas of provincial jurisdiction as well. So basically, they were circumventing the constitutional guarantee of the provincial ownership of natural resources. Now, all the while that they're doing this, they're also benefiting from Alberta's oil resources. The federal government is receiving billions and billions of dollars every year from the same industry that they're trying to shut down. And there's a University of Calgary economist named Robert Manzel, and for decades he's been following this issue, and he calculated that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net contribution of $630 billion to Canada. And of course, that was in up to 2018, and so there's been a few years since, so it's actually higher than that by now. So everything I've talked about so far is the bad news, and now I get to the good news. Now, the good news is provincial secession is allowed under Canada's constitutional law. And the reason for that is, you might remember in 1995, Quebec had a referendum on independence that was almost passed, but just barely defeated. So in the wake of that referendum, the Supreme Court sent a reference case to the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada. So what that is the provincial and federal governments are allowed to send questions to the Supreme Court to ask for rulings on Canada's constitutional law. So the federal government asked the Supreme Court of Canada whether Quebec could unilaterally secede from Canada. And the Supreme Court said Quebec could not unilaterally secede from Canada. However, if Quebec held a referendum with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people voted in favor of it, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate Quebec's independence. So with this decision, the Supreme Court created a constitutional pathway for any province in Canada to peacefully separate from Canada. Because although the decision was about Quebec, the ruling applies to every province. So any province in Canada, if it would hold a clear if it held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority of people voted in favor of that, then the federal government is obligated to negotiate that province's independence. Now, this is very different from many other countries for Canada to allow this, because in many countries it's forbidden for any particular region or jurisdiction to leave. And you might remember in 2017, the Catalonia region of Spain voted to leave Spain, but instead of being allowed to leave, the government of Spain arrested the leaders of that referendum, because in Spain, the constitutional law does not allow any jurisdiction to leave. So their law is different. So that example of Spain cannot be used against the idea of Alberta becoming independent, because Canada's constitutional law is clear that provinces can leave the country under those two circumstances. That is a clear referendum, a clear majority on a clear referendum question. Now, all of this is to conclude that Alberta must become independent. You know, we've looked at, I've talked about people over the years who have proposed different solutions for making things better for Western Canada, like John Barr in 1971 saying we should try and make Canada better, and if that doesn't work, then the West should become independent. Then Ernest Manning and his colleagues in 1981 saying something very similar. We need to reform the national institutions, and if we can't reform those institutions, then there will be a movement towards independence. Then David Kilgour in 1988, 34 years ago, saying the time has come to fix these problems. And most of all, Preston Manning and the Reform Party of Canada. They did the most to try and reform Canada, with, you know, getting all those men elected all those people elected in the 1990s that we sent to Ottawa to try and make things better for the West, and it didn't work. So they found that Canada could not be fixed, and this is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that is beneficial for Alberta. And this is a way that we can learn from history, because we can learn from history and we must learn from history. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party of Canada could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it can't be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but it does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is to get out. If we keep asking Central Canada If we keep asking Central Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they will just keep laughing at us. They know there's nothing we can do within Canada, so they'll just keep laughing at us. But if we hold a referendum and vote for independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. You know, even Jason Kenney complains about the, unfair treatment. Jason Kenney challenged the carbon tax unsuccessfully. Jason Kenney held a referendum on equalization and accomplished nothing. You know, we've tried and tried and tried all these different things and they don't work. So Alberta must now defend itself, and that involves pursuing independence. Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about and become an independent country. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Should be an auctioneer.
I talked too fast. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Michael has some books at the corner table here on independence. And also you can sign up for Alberta Prosperity Project. So it doesn't cost a lot of money. And you can also sign a petition, because it's a petition to force a referendum is what we're really trying to achieve here, because that's what Michael was talking about, and that's what we really want, is get everybody's signature. I don't even know what the young people can sign as well. You don't have to be 18, or I think I don't know what the age limit is, but there isn't any age limit, so get your kids to sign it too. So anyways, because by forcing a referendum, then the government has to act, and it's not a political decision. And then we are in the control seat, or we're in the driver's seat, and it's a grassroots movement, and no political organization can afford a massive revolt amongst the people, because that's what this is really about. It's a peaceful revolt, and if we make this happen, Saskatchewan will follow suit. Well, I'll let Dr. Modry talk about that. But anyways, so our next speaker is going to be Dr. Roger Hodkinson. And I'll just he has he has more credentials than all the people in Alberta Health Services put together. So I'll let him speak.